Question number 3, the Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Mr. Speaker, this question is to the Prime Minister and asks, does he stand by all his statements?
The Honourable Bill English on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, yes.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Why does he stand by his statement about New Zealand's tax haven status, that it is, quotes, not an embarrassment, into quotes, and, quotes, government will not change any tax rules until the IRD has looked at the issue, end of quotes, given the same man, you're getting it, Sunshine, you just wait.
Order, just complete the question.
Yeah, well, boldly over, you wanted to know. Given the same man who found there was nothing to see about the wine box, namely John Nash, is again in charge of looking at the rules.
The Honourable Bill English on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, well, New Zealand doesn't have, quote, tax haven status, much as the member might want that to be the case. It simply isn't. And if he's worried about who's looking at the rules, the OECD apparently are going to review our rules again next year, and I expect they'll give a somewhat similar opinion as they did last time, which is that our rules...
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Point of order.
Mr. Speaker, I'm asking...
Order. I'll call the member first. The Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Good God. I'm asking this Minister as to why John Nash is the person looking at the rules. I don't want to hear about anybody else.
Order.
Just why John Nash is being relied upon.
Order. And then that should well have been the supplementary, and I could have helped the member, but that was not the supplementary. It was a very lengthy supplementary, gave the Minister more opportunity to answer and address the question. Further supplementaries?
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question. The Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Is John Nash, IRD's International Revenue Strategy Manager, the same John Nash who admitted in the 1995 Commission of Inquiry that IRD did not begin a serious examination of key wine box transactions until 1 month after a minister had assured this House it had?
The Honourable Bill English on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I have no idea.
Oh, we know that. Supplementary question.
Supplementary question. Right Honourable Winston
How
Peters.
much confidence does he have in John Nash leading an inquiry by IRD into New Zealand's involvement in the foreign trusts when he never understood the wine box fraud on the revenue? Now being put up as an expert saying there is no fraud in the Panama Papers transactions in New Zealand. Why would you trust that man?
The Honourable Bill English on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the IRD is an independent, statutorily independent entity. Whatever officials it uses is really their business. But the member can be assured there are no parallels between the foreign trusts and the Cook Islands thing that he's referring to. In this case, the concern about tax avoidance are concerns held by the Mexican government, the Maltese government, not by the New Zealand government. There's no suggestion that these trusts are used to erode New Zealand's tax base, because we can't tax these people.
Supplementary question, Speaker.
Supplementary question. The Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Why on earth is IRD putting up John Nash as some sort of authority that New Zealand is, I quote, a model citizen in respect of trusts, and that of the nearly 12,000 trusts that have been scrutinised, few problems have been found, end of quotes, when his proven lack of expertise is why so many now, internationally, including the economists, think that we are a tax haven?
The Honourable Bill English on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's unfortunate that the member is resorting to some of his old habits of attacking public servants under the protection of Parliament in a very personal way. I doubt very much that it will influence the expertise or the focus of IRD in dealing with any relevant issues. But I want, with respect to these trusts, but I must stress to the member, because he's giving a misleading impression that somehow this discussion about foreign trusts is to do with New Zealand taxes and what people pay here. It is not. It's nothing to do with the New Zealand tax base, which is among the most comprehensive and best organised in the developed world.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question, Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Why, Minister, when the growing scandal is about us being a tax haven, is he seeking to use every other detour or roadblock to not answer the question?
Honourable Bill English on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, we're not a tax haven. It's really only the opposition parties in New Zealand who are claiming that. And secondly, if the member doesn't understand or respect the constitutional position of IRD as independent from the politicians, then he represents a real danger to future governance in New Zealand. Because if he believes the government should be fingering individual officials on the basis of what the opposition thinks about them, then this government has more integrity and principle than that and won't do it.
Supplementary question. Seeing he's put the question...
Order.
Supplementary question.
Order. Supplementary question, Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Seeing he's put the issue of integrity on the table, and the Prime Minister has said that the IRD has informed the Aussie authorities...
Order. Can I have the supplementary question, please?
Well, you're getting it.
Well, Order. Member will resume his seat. He will stand and apologise for that remark. I want him to ask supplementary questions in line with standing orders.
Point of order.
No, member will stand.
Well, I'll apologise.
Order.
I'm apologising.
Thank you.
Point of order.
Point of order.
Mr Speaker, with the greatest of respect, I've been here longer than you and I know how to answer a question.
Order. Order. The member will leave the chamber. Order. 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 Is this a supplementary question?
Supplementary.
Supplementary question. Ron Mark.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. When the Australian banks are so donkey deep in Panama Papers, appearing 8,948 times, did IRD share all of those appearances with the Australian tax authorities? And has this government been aware of that?
Order. The Honourable Bill English on behalf of the Prime Minister, either of those two supplementary. Does the member want the question again?
Mr Speaker, I think a charitable description of that would be the question was unclear. I'm sure IRD have met their obligations to any other government, because ultimately this issue is about other governments' policing of their taxpayers. If they ask anything of the New Zealand government IRD for cooperation, then my understanding is IRD provides them with information.
Question number